فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary and a Common Word podcast. A Common Word podcast focuses on Islam and interreligious studies. It is inspired by the Quranic verse 364, which calls the people of the book to a common word, and the Common Word initiative held in 2007 in Amman, Jordan. It interviews scholars, activists, and practitioners in the realm of bridge building, peace studies, and social justice. When I first started my work in Islam and interreligious studies, I was attracted to the framework of Abrahamic religions. I came of age post 9/11, and at the time there was a large discussion and dialogue around the idea of Abrahamic faiths. Jews, Christians, and Muslims should come together, understand their differences, and go back to the original founder of all the faiths, of Abraham. However, in the last couple of years, I've been traveling to Southeast Asia through the Brzezinski Institute for Global Virtual Learning. And in Southeast Asia, I've seen the power and relevance of Islam. But in Southeast Asia, you see other religions that aren't part of the Abrahamic faiths. You see Hinduism, Buddhism, and other Asian religions. Today, I sit down with Khairudin Aljunied, who is one of the foremost experts on Islam in Southeast Asia. He's written books such as Islam in Malaysia and Shapers of Islam in Southeast Asia, Muslim Intellectuals, and Making of Islamic Reformism. I got to know Khairudin Aljunied when he was occupying the chair of Islam in Southeast Asia at Georgetown University. When I traveled back to the region, I got in touch with him and visited him in his home country of Singapore. Here is my interview with Khairudin Aljunied. Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary and a Common Word podcast. So today I'm very fortunate and lucky to have a good friend of mine, Khairudin Junaid, on the show. And he will be speaking about his remarkable books and works regarding Islam in Southeast Asia. So Khairudin, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much for having me here today, Yunus.
So could you maybe introduce yourself specifically? Can you speak about your spiritual biography? So how did you come to your academic profile, writing these different books? How did you find meaning and purpose? And how did that lead to your research and writing?
All right. So my name is Khairudin Al-Junaid, and I think as the name suggests, I'm from the Hadrami Arab family in Singapore. So we are a diasporic community that has been here. We have been here for over a century now, very active in the region. And my mother's side of the family is actually Indian. So if we want to talk about my spiritual biography, it'll be like Arab, Indian, and both sides of the family. As you know, the Hadramis, they're very strong when it comes to Sufistic practices, but they are also scholars in their own right. Many of them actually spread Islam in this region, and I see myself as part and parcel of that genealogy. In reality, I actually didn't want to be a scholar. I actually wanted to be an actor, but that didn't come true, and thank God for it. I would have been a disaster. But more importantly, I was an activist when I was younger. So I always tell the young ones out there that I was an activist that became a scholar rather than a scholar that, in a sense, become activistic. So a lot of the books that I've written so far is actually a kind of an embodiment of my earlier life, very much concerned with the issue of change and reform, trying to help communities out there. And I structure a lot of my writings in that kind of mode. So spiritually, very, I would say, Shariatic, Sufistic. And of course, more when it comes to socially or relationally, I think I'm the kind of person who's very much involved in community work here in Singapore, more broadly in Southeast Asia. And I see myself more as a scholar activist, more than, the kind of professors that you see in the university.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. And yeah, actor, I can see that that you initially wanted to go in that profession. And that background has always fascinated me, the Arab, the Southeast Asian part of you. You use the word cosmopolitan in your work a lot. Could you speak about that word in relation to your background and
Yeah, so the word cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitan actually came from the Greek word cosmos and politan. Again, I use that word for the lack of a better term that you can find in the English language to kind of explain the Quranic injunction of inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qabaila lita'arafu. So the whole idea of lita'arafu in the Malay language is called ta'aruf, and the same word from the Arabic original. And if you have traveled into Southeast Asia, whether you go to Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Southern Thailand, Southern Philippines, you can see that the people here are always smiling, very open-minded, very hospitable, and more importantly, they will make sure that you feel at ease whenever you come here. The word that the Malays use is actually ta'aruf, and the other word is actually keterbukaan. They are always open to cultures, languages, ways of lives that came from overseas. And I wanted to capture that manifestation of Islam in everyday life, which to me would be a counterpoint to how the media have portrayed Islam, especially in this region, as a source of division and conflict. So I tried to move from the eventful to the everyday life. And all of my books are actually structured around this theme and other themes as well. The point is actually to show that Islam, not only in Southeast Asia, but everywhere else, is actually an Islam that is always receiving, learning, and also fusing different cultures, languages, and ways of life to become a new dynamic.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. And one of the things I noticed too when I travel to Southeast Asia is that openness, the relaxed, laid back, jovial, sometimes joking a lot. And
Right.
and I really love that based on other places, I've traveled in the world. And I think that warm, hospitable nature is one of the reasons I've become more interested in Islam in Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia in general. So great. So maybe we could move now to your recent book. So you're remarkably prolific. You've written several books. And could you speak about maybe some of the themes that your books touch upon? Why did you pick these topics?
Mhm.
And what is the common ideas or points of view that runs throughout them?
Right. So I was in New York in 2013 and I was at Columbia University. And when I was there on a Fulbright, one of those things that I observed is that the Americans know very little about Southeast Asia. The only thing that they know about Southeast Asia are things like it's good to be in Thailand for obvious reasons. They want to enjoy life in Thailand. Whenever we talk to them about Indonesia and Malaysia, they know nothing about those places except for news items that talk about radical Islam. And I saw that there was a void in understanding. It is not only a problem in North America, it's also an issue in Europe. And what I wanted to do was to give a portrayal of a region that I call home, which is also the archive of my research, that is different from how it has been written by scholars from the outside. So I always see myself as what has been called as a home scholar, someone who's also involved in the cultural politics and also in the issues on the ground in my own society. And I wanted to give a depiction of Southeast Asian Islam and Muslim community and Muslim non-Muslim relations in a totally different way than what has been written by outsider scholars. Of course, the whole idea of outsider and insider is very superfluous and ambiguous. But what I'm trying to show is that someone who has lived long enough in the region may see things through different lenses or different lens than people who are from the outside. So I began basically in New York conceptualizing this whole so-called project, what I call as the Muslim cosmopolitanism project. I finished the first book called Muslim Cosmopolitanism, Southeast Asian Islam in Comparative Perspective, and I realized that it wasn't good enough. What I did was to show various expressions of cosmopolitanism and then presented it again when I was in Washington, D.C. And I thought that as I was presenting it, that the Americans weren't convinced. So I set out to write another book, and this time to show that not only the common people were cosmopolitan, even the scholars too are cosmopolitan. So I wrote another book that was published by Cornell. It was on this scholar called Hamka, Haji Abdul Malik Karim Amrullah. When I used the word Hamka, the Arabs were unhappy because the word Hamka in Arabic, Ahmak, means someone that is like deranged, an idiot or something like that. But it's just a short form for his name. And he was such an open-minded scholar who drew from Western, Eastern, Arab, African traditions, Indian, to write many of his books, including a completed tafsir of the Quran. I finished that book. It was published by Cornell, but again, I felt that it was not strong enough. So I was then based in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University as the Malaysia chair of Islam in Southeast Asia, and felt that maybe I should write a longer dure history, a history of 1,000 years about this part of the world, focusing specifically on Malaysia with a wider view of Southeast Asia to, in a sense, inform my own people, but more so the people in the West, how Islam had interacted with other cultures. So later on, we can talk about this a little bit more deeply. But one of those things, one of the arguments that I made in that book is that Islam wouldn't have spread in the region without the agency of non-Muslims. That at the end of the day, if you look at Islam as a religion, the religion wouldn't have been so powerful if not for non-Muslims helping Muslims to spread and to live their lives as Muslims in the region. Finish that book, unhappy again with that book. I have this problem. My wife is always always angry about it, that you should just take a rest, and you finish your third book and that's it, spend more time with the family. So I decided to write the next one, where I go back to the whole idea of how intellectuals also had tried to push forth the whole idea of cosmopolitanism. That was the book called Shapers of Islam in Southeast Asia, where I looked at 7 key intellectuals, Naqib Alatas, Zakia Darajat, Ahmad Ibrahim, and so forth, who had, in a sense, pushed for so many reforms for Muslims to open themselves up in the aftermath of colonialism. So after the end of colonialism in Southeast Asia, there were a lot of movements, what they call as third world movements, Marxist movements, socialists, and so forth and so forth. And there was this caving in of Muslim life. The whole idea of the politics of identity became so big. And I wanted to show that there were these intellectuals who were trying hard to change those kinds of realities and to respond to the West in a higher order and intellectual way. Finished that book. I thought, okay, that's it. 4 books, trilogy done, plus 1. And then I went into like a spiritual crisis, I guess. It was COVID, and I felt that I lost, or I did not write about one aspect of Southeast Asia that is so pervasive, which is Sufism. So I wrote this is the last of the pentology, where I wrote about the spread of Sufism for over 800 years in the region, and making the argument that Sufism is so powerful in this region because it has always been a dialogical tradition, a tradition that's always in dialogue with peoples, with ideas, with cultures, and with the environment around them. So that's all. Basically, I think the whole point of all of these books is to put Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian Islam back in the map of what we can call in broad terms the Western academe, and to give a different grand narrative that, in a sense, would counter, if not complement, the kind of narratives that we have heard from the West.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah. And one of the things that's helped me reading your work, I recently read the work Islam in Southeast Asia, just understanding that region and providing a general introduction. Oftentimes we have this idea of Islam spread by the sword, but then you're hearing about these Sufi networks and these traders, and then seeing how Islam in Southeast Asia is connected to Yemen, as you mentioned already, and to the Arab world. So oftentimes we think these are like separate regions. And maybe that leads to our next question, is that the study of Islam in North America often focuses on the Middle East. So how does studying Islam in Southeast Asia enhance our understanding of Islam And before you answer, maybe I could even speak a little bit about myself. And part of my education, I went to Georgetown. You were there as well, and we got to first know each other. And I went to university, and they had a strong Arabic program. I got a master's in Arab studies. Then I did a PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies. And there was never really a class on Bahasa, for instance, that you could take, the language of Southeast Asia. And I was only really exposed to Islam in Southeast Asia through Osman Bakr, who was the chair of Islamic Studies and chair of Islam in Southeast Asia, which you later went on to occupy. So yeah, so I think a lot of us here in North America, our training is even very Middle East centric, very Arabic focused, and then Southeast Asia gets lost. Could you speak more about that for us and why we should study Southeast
Y-
Asia?
Yeah, so Marshall Hodgson, the great scholar of historical Islam, wrote in his iconic book, The Venture of Islam, that the study of Islam, and he wrote this in the 60s, suffered from what he calls as the Arabist bias. And he said that precisely because Orientalists of his time were particularizing Islam as an Arabian phenomenon, that we cannot see the diverse manifestations of Islam all over the world. Now, he didn't say that there were many Islams. That was not his point. And that's why he used the word Islamicate, that there were different expressions of Islam as you travel around many lands. And one of those places that he looked at was what he calls, in broad terms, again, Malaysia. He didn't want to use the word Malay world. He used the word Malaysia because he said that the people in this region spoke Malay, and Sia means that they still see themselves as part of the larger continent called Asia. Now, this lack of attention to Islam in Southeast Asia not only has to do with the fact that the Middle East has become the center of attention, it has also to do with the problems that you see in the study of Southeast Asia by Southeast Asians themselves. Now,
Mm,
one beautiful thing about Middle Eastern study scholars is that they tend to use the region as a way to theorize about the rest of the Muslim world. And that's why a lot of the works that are coming out from Middle Eastern studies are used and applied in the study of other parts of the world. So great scholars, I mean, you can talk with me, we can name names, right? And in Southeast Asia, we always hear this man called Clifford Gates, who wrote his iconic book, of course, The Religion of Java. He was a theorist more than an anthropologist, and that made a difference. But for the longest time, a lot of his theories, where he studied Muslims in Southeast Asia, were actually not used by people in Middle Eastern studies, precisely because they felt that he was not studying Islam. He was just studying what they called then as the little tradition of Islam. So this whole division between the big tradition and the little tradition then became pervasive in area studies, in many disciplines. And the other issue is also the locals, and you're talking about the Muslim themselves, who have been studying Islam in Southeast Asia, tend to submit to what I've called in my latest book as the diffusionist theory of Islam, which means that even when they want to provide a counter narrative and try to position Southeast Asia back into the center of the study of Islam, they still use the same theories that have been developed either by the West or by experts of Middle Eastern studies. So you have like a double problem, right? It's a double whammy situation. The Middle Eastern studies producing all these theories and applied elsewhere. The people in Southeast Asia taking their theories, they are almost derivative about it, and applying it to the study of Southeast Asian Islam. So, and this is why anyone who wants to reposition Southeast Asia Islam into the study of Southeast Asia, of Islamic societies as a whole, they need then to engage at 4 different levels. The first level is to theorize the region again, right?
mm,
And to come up with theories that explain Islam in the region that can then be applied to other regions as well. The second issue is actually the issue of concepts, which again, Marshall Hodgson was trying to say that a lot of the Orientalists use wrong conceptual tools. They use a lot of tools that were derived from the study of Christianity and applied it into Islamic studies. And Southeast Asians have not produced their own concepts. So the second level. The third level is actually a deeper one, which is a methodological one, where we need to come up with our own methodologies in order to show that from the empirical base that we have, we can approach the study of Muslim societies differently than what has been done in the Middle East. And of course, last but not least, and I think this one is almost challenging enough, is to link the region, Southeast Asia, with the rest of the Muslim world without putting Southeast Asia at the periphery. So challenging the whole notion of core and periphery that is so powerful in the study of Islam as a whole, rather to position Muslims in Southeast Asia and Islam in Southeast Asia as but another core within this whole matrix of Islam that has spread to the entire world. And of course, it applies to African Islam, to Islam in China, and so forth and so forth. Each of these places had produced their own core, but it has not been explained well enough by the scholars here. And in fact, I think I do suffer from a kind of, like, I would say, neglect by people in the field, partly because many of scholars of the Arab world will say there's nothing really there. And I've gotten this kind of brushing off in quite a number of occasions. They're saying that, all of those things in Southeast Asian Islam, but mere copy productions of what we have seen in India or in the Arab world. And this is something that I think we need to combat against, but we need to write as much as possible in order to flood the field with new concepts, with new methodologies, with new theories, and more importantly, with new conceptualization of what historical and global Islam actually mean.
Oh, fascinating. And I noticed that too when I traveled to Southeast Asia, Malaysia, that how interconnected the region is with the Muslim world. So here in the United States, sometimes, like you said, we see Southeast Asia as part of the periphery, it's got isolated. But when you go to Malaysia, for instance, a lot of the scholars have studied at Azhar, or people like yourself have taught here in the United States and have Western education. So that's something I've definitely noticed, how interconnected and how influential the region is to the entire Muslim world, but also how the Muslim world is connected to Southeast Asia. So since this show is about Islam and interreligious studies, could you speak about Islam and other religions in Southeast Asia? And what do we learn there? And you somewhat alluded to this already, that non-Muslims helped with the spread of Islam, and that by itself sounds like sounds like an intriguing or
Yeah.
oxymoron there. So yeah, could you speak about Islam's relationship with other religions in
All
Southeast
right.
Asia?
So I always remind Muslims here that Malays, who are the majority in this region, or Malay Indonesian, they were Hindu Buddhists longer than they have been Muslims. So they adopted a syncretic religion called Hindu Buddhism because it was like an amalgamation of two religions for a few thousand years. And that so-called religion and beliefs have not faded away. Until today, Malays still believe in ghosts, and they believe in 55 different types of ghosts with particular names to them. There are a lot of Hindu Buddhist practices in Malay weddings up until today. They even practiced by people who are graduates of Azhar, and in fact sometimes Medina too, without them realizing it. So the cultures of the Hindu Buddhists have seeped and has implanted itself so deeply in Southeast Asia that it has not been dislodged. In fact, even, and I was talking about concepts just now, even the concepts that Muslims use here to describe worship is still from what we call as Sanskrit, from the Sanskrit conceptual box, right? Conceptual toolbox. For example, we use salah in Arabic. They use sembahyang, which means to pray to the one, right? It's called saum in Arabic, but here they call it puasa. And puasa is actually the practice of the Hindus here, which means that to abstain from eating except for drinking. And a lot of other words that they use. Even when it comes to describing God, they use Allah, but they also commonly use Tuhan, which is from Sanskrit again. So precisely because of the deep-rootedness of Hindu Buddhism, that Muslims, when they come into this region, took a lot of the practices of the people in the past and fuse it with Islam. And I have argued in other places that when they were doing da'wah, especially the Arabs, the Indians, and even the Chinese who came from China to spread Islam here, they subscribed to this whole idea of syar'un man qablana, that they take the shara that came before them, and then see how it is congruent to Islam, and let whatever that was there in the past to coexist with the Islamic present. And of course, what we have now is actually a melting pot of so many traditions. Even though generally people call themselves Muslims, practically many religions, many cultures are actually embedded in their day-to-day practices. Then that leads us to the relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims. Before the coming of certain fundamentalist movements, and in fact before the coming of colonialism in the region, Muslims and non-Muslim got along well. Of course, in any country, in any place, in all over the world, there would have been conflicts, but there has never been large-scale religious conflicts until the colonial powers came. So when the Dutch, the Spanish, the Americans, and of course the Portuguese and the British, who were the longest here and the most powerful actually in the whole region other than the Dutch, what they did was to come up with concepts that divide first Muslims from within. They call it the kaum adat, the people who hold on to customs, against the kaum santri, the people who were more religious. And then they drew divisions by racializing communities. So then they divided the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Muslims, and the Christians, especially the Christians, against the Muslims. Divisions came about, and all the cosmopolitan cultures and interactions that were there before then fizzled out slowly. Not that colonialism basically removed all of the cosmopolitanism that was there, but it did build divisions that became a hallmark of the ordering of post-colonial states. So like today in Singapore, Malaysia, there's this stress that you must define yourself as part of a racial group. And that's why I began my book, Muslim Cosmopolitanism, by saying that the school principal couldn't accept that I was not paying school fees, because Malays don't have to pay school fees here. But the principal was telling me, your name implies that you are Arab. Why is it that you classify yourself as Malay? And I was explaining to her that I don't fit in any of these categories. But I can say that I'm Homo sapien. So short of being punished for being too smart, she was telling me, you got to pay your school fees because you are not Malay, right? No matter what your identity card says. So this is the legacy of colonialism that right now a lot of Muslims in Southeast Asia are trying to dismantle, especially the younger ones. And the younger ones embrace what has been called as hyphenated identities. They are both Muslim and they are also a citizen of a given country. But more importantly, especially the 6 children that I have, do not even identify themselves to places. They see themselves as citizens of the world. I mean, not many people actually feel Singaporean right now. They actually feel that they are part of parcel of an Instagram community, part and parcel of an advocacy group. And I'm trying to say that when we go back to the past, it's almost like driving, right? You look at the rear view mirror. When you look at the past before the coming of colonialism, that was how people lived, like the young people right now, that they see each other beyond racial lines, even though they are aware of their origins and their backgrounds. And this is the project that I'm trying to push for first intellectually, but of course, turning it into programs out there if possible. It's difficult because race is still the organizing principle of many of these countries in Southeast Asia, but things are moving to a good direction. That's why Muslims and non-Muslims right now, especially in Malaysia, Indonesia, they are forming coalitions to bring about a cosmopolitan society. They just don't have the explanatory tool or concept to describe what they are doing. And this is where we scholars come in to tell them, hey, you're just being cosmopolitan and it's fine because your great grandfathers had done it and it's possible again today.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, wow, that's really interesting to see. And I noticed that the new parties have been developed, new coalitions are interreligious, that are not only limited to ethnicity and Islam. So, on this point of interreligious dialogue, you've obviously traveled here to the United States. You were at Georgetown for a little bit. So, we often talk about in the West Abrahamic dialogue. And that's something between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. I came of age after 9/11, and that term was used a lot, Abrahamic, and it still has currency today. So when I came to travel to Southeast Asia, you see, as you mentioned already, there's Hindus, there's Buddhists. So how would you describe interreligious dialogue in Southeast Asia, and how is it different or similar with the presence of Buddhists and Hindus?
Well, in my book, I actually mentioned that there are so many churches, mosques, temples all over Southeast Asia that are built next to religious places that are different from theirs, and they
Hmm.
coexist. If you travel into East Malaysia, to Sarawak, for example, the churches and the mosques would share the same car parks. So on Fridays, Muslims can park their cars in a church next to the mosque. On Sundays, the Christians park their cars in the mosque, and they are fine about it. Right? There's no problem at all, and people are coexisting very very easily. And when we talk about dialogue, to me, this is the real dialogue. I
Hmm.
always am skeptical about religious leaders coming together, having a kumbaya and saying, I respect you, you respect me, we love each other, brother, let's hug and let's pray together. I feel that that kind of high level dialogue would only preach to the converted. We need to have that. We need to have certain positions that are made by inter-religious leaders about them being united. But I think we need to register the fact that at an everyday level, this dialogue is already ongoing. People are helping each other. Even in times of conflicts, Muslims and non-Muslims are actually working together to ensure that everybody is safe. Now, especially in Malaysia and Indonesia, because of the monsoon season, there are floods everywhere and homes are going to be lost. And you can see, non-Muslims helping Muslims to rebuild their religious places, and Muslims helping non-Muslims to allay a lot of their anxieties and to help them in times of need. These dialogues are the things that we need to talk a little bit about, and also to show how people don't actually look at their religious backgrounds when it comes to solving the day-to-day problems of society. And I think when it comes to Southeast Asia, and this is where I think you can compare it a little bit with the US. My little experience of staying in the US is that if you don't watch the news, America is such a great place to stay, right? But once you turn on the news, what you see are events that don't reflect what you see when you go to the pharmacies out there. People are generally very, very nice. I mean, I lived in North Herndon. Maybe that's not a representative of the whole of the US, but certainly it's so multicultural. It's so friendly. And in fact, my kids loved it. They wouldn't have gone back if not for the fact that I had to go back. They loved it so much. And that's precisely the kind of life that you see in Southeast Asia. Everywhere in Southeast Asia. In fact, even in places where what we call as conservative states, and here I'm talking about Kelantan. Kelantan is the northern tip of Malaysia. It's ruled right now by an Islamic party called the Parti Islam Se-Malaysia. If you actually travel into Kelantan, you will see Chinese communities there. And these people speak in the Lahja or the dialect of the Kelantanese. And the best part of it all is that they eat with their hands, right?
Hmm.
They basically nativize themselves. So even in conservative states, this cosmopolitanism is happening. The dialogue is happening at everyday life. I just came back from Penang and I went to the shop to repair my watch, and the uncle is a Chinese man who knew that, okay, surely you're either Indian or something else, right? He repaired the watch and looked at me and said, you're a good guy, take this watch and don't pay me anything. So these are the things that I feel that we have here. And that's why Southeast Asia is not only unique, it's such a great place to stay. Now, some of the detractors of my work say that, so how about the crazies? How about these people who are pushing for a certain hardline Islam? I say, well, they exist in every society. You have people carrying guns in the US, but not everyone carry guns. And not everyone is going to shoot you as you go down to the supermarket, right? The point being that all of these people who are fundamentalists, radical, extremists, closed up, parochial, they don't actually represent the majority of society. And the thing is that, as I mentioned just now, they always make the news. And that makes the difference. That kind of dissolve all of these dialogues that you see at everyday life. And now we see the non-dialogue happening. So I feel that one of our duties, especially as people who are specializing in Islamic studies, is to shift our focus from scriptures and texts to looking at context and how people in context then manifest the text, how they ground. And that's why I began my book. And in fact, in few of my books, I actually cite the Quran and says that and mention that the Quran is not only recited and read in Southeast Asia, they are lived and manifested in the lives of the people. And that's why one Indonesian scholar by the name of Azumardi Azra, who's passed on, he said that Muslims in Islam in Southeast Asia is a smiling Islam. Even when they are unhappy with you, they smile. Right? And this has become a culture because at the end of the day, respect, dialogue, and ensuring peace is the big thing when it comes to the life of Muslims and non-Muslims here.
Oh, great. Yeah, I love that point about not just focusing on text. I think a lot in religious dialogue, especially here in the United States and the West, is about reading scripture, which is very valuable. But the idea of the day-to-day and the lived religion. So can you speak a little bit more about that? Maybe some more examples of the day-to-day interreligious interaction and what we can learn from that?
Well, I mean, I can give an example in Singapore. Nowadays, we have this big mosque. It's the oldest mosque, one of the oldest mosques in Singapore, called the Sultan Mosque. And I think I brought you there before. It's such a huge mosque. And they have like a special place where non-Muslims can come in and view the mosque. They have like guided tours for people to come into the mosque. Even in Malaysia now, in many places, they are allowing non-Muslims to come. In some mosques in Malaysia, of course, some people are unhappy about it and they are minority. They even allow non-Muslims to celebrate their Chinese New Year in the mosque. And of course, it would generate a lot of heat. People are arguing about so many schools of Islamic law and so forth and so forth. But these things are happening. And as I mentioned just now, young people, they are now looking across or beyond religious lines and saying that we all share the same terrain and domain, but we also share the same concerns. So everybody's now talking about issues of poverty, issues of unemployment. Now there's a lot of talk about food security. So Muslims and non-Muslims are coming together. And of course, the big thing that is bringing the young folks together now from all walks of life, Muslims and non-Muslims, is the issue of environmental preservation. Right? So it's a big thing. If you have a campaign called Rescue Cats, you're going to see everyone coming. So this is happening beyond mere talk about Muslim, non-Muslim so-called relations. Muslims and non-Muslims are relationally getting along on so many fronts, in so many dimensions. What has not been done, at least to me, is for the religious leaders to actually show how they then do it. And this is, again, I want to throw it back to them, right? In as much as they do all these interreligious dialogues and all, which is a good thing, but what we need to them to show is how you can form coalitions with non-Muslims to do things together, programs that help the community. Then by doing so, you position Islam as this cosmopolitan religion. That is actually the challenge. So I always tell people, the issue is not downstream. The issue is upstream. The interpretation of the text by many of the scholars that we have out there needs to be challenged and needs to be revised such that they can then incorporate how people on the ground actually live their lives as Muslims, getting along with non-Muslims, and for them to, in a sense, look at the scriptures from that angle of vision. And that's tough, if I can say it. To convince people on the ground, it's easy because to them, going to the marketplace, and I wrote this in my book, that if you want to buy vegetables, the only people who are selling it in so many markets all over Southeast Asia are Chinese, right? So you don't want to buy vegetables from Chinese, you have to buy even if they are non-Muslims, and many products as well, right? But when you go upstream, when it comes to scriptural interpretations, that's where people start to close in and say that, if we open up too much, what would then happen? So I teach in my current module in the National University of Singapore that there is this fear of contamination, that the
Mm.
tradition gets contaminated by something from the outside. When, as I was telling my students, if and some of my students are actually non-Muslims, right? That if you look at the Quran in itself talks about other religions. In fact, no
Hmm.
other religion in the world has so many references to other religions than the Quran. You can study all other religions in the world except for Baha'ism, which is amalgamation of so many other different religions. But when you talk about the Abrahamic faiths that you were talking about just now, simply by doing this comparative scriptural study, only the Quran talks about not only the Christians, the Jews, because I mean it's a later faith, but also talk about the Dahriyun, the people who believe in time, about the people who are materialists, all sorts of faiths in one text. That has not been explained, I think, enough.
Great. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And to conclude, is there anything else you'd like to share based on our discussion? And is there anything specifically you're working on? Are you adding to the pantheon of books you've already written?
Yeah, so I take the advice by Professor John Esposito. He's already retired now. He said that, enough of Southeast Asia. You got to move on. Okay, so he came here and we had dinner together and said, you've done your part. I know you are, in a kind of mode of trying to explain what Southeast Asia is. It's done. It's time to move on. So I'm writing actually a book on Islamic reformism.
Hmm.
And the title of the book is Islamic Reformism: A History in Books.
Hmm.
And I'm making the argument that there are around 20 books, 20 iconic books that have shaped Islamic reformist thought. Beginning with, of course, Muhammad Abdu, because I begin in the 19th century, all the way until today. Of course, the book of Jasir Auda and so forth and so forth. And I'm trying to make the argument, tentatively at least, that these books are not only texts, they are events. And here I take
Hmm.
from the work of Edward Said. In his book, The World, the Text, and the Critiques, and the Critique, he said that books, when written, have lives of their own. And the lives or the social lives of books go beyond it being read by literate communities. But books, when written, actually shape the lives of societies because societies read them and then try to embody them in their everyday practices. And we know when we talk about books pertaining to Islamic reformism, they did shape many parts of the Muslim world. But there hasn't been a text that showed how these books were consumed and became part and parcel of the grammar and vocabulary of the societies that they were in. So books by Iqbal, for example, the reconstruction of Islamic of thought in Islam, for example, they were used basically as the ideological tool for the founding fathers of Pakistan. And the same is it if you look at Said Nursi, the words, right? They are still read. I went to Istanbul and joined this halaqah of Said Nursi. They read these books as much as they read the Quran. So it's quite wonderful. Actually, if you look at it, I mean, how these texts are so powerful in the minds of these people. And the same in Southeast Asia, you can see the tafsir of Hamka everywhere, especially in mosques. They are there and they are part and parcel, they are events in the life of people here. So that's my project right now. On the side, when I'm not sleeping, I just put together a book of essays. And this is just something that I'm doing to give the last salvo to Southeast Asia. I just gathered together a book of essays that talks about the people's history of Singapore. So
Hmm.
again, trying to show how Muslims and non-Muslims have gotten along well in Singapore, despite the fact that race is the organizing principle of this country. But people have moved beyond that kind of discourse and trying to incorporate a more open-ended identity. So that's that. I'm gonna like kind of slow down. I'll be 50 by next year, and I think the body is telling the mind that you need to take things at a slower pace. So yeah.
And that's great. Wow, I'm really excited to read those works. So thanks so much, Khairudin Aljunied, for this interview.
Thank you so much.
And that was my interview with Khairudin Al Junaid. So many things stuck out to me. First, the idea of cosmopolitanism. Here in the United States, and in North America, we often operate within an Abrahamic framework, that of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, as Khairudin explains, that for a large part of the history of people and Muslims in Southeast Asia, there was a Hindu-Buddhist framework. And this leads to new opportunities and potentials. It's common for people in Southeast Asia to have differences of religion and cultural practices. As he mentioned, even the car park or the parking lot is shared between churches and mosques. Another thing that stuck out to me was his activist background. When you read his work and his writing, it's not overly theoretical and ivory tower. However, you can see that his scholarship is a direct result of his activism, of growing up in an age of Islamic revival, also of interreligious partnerships and coalitions, as well as for promoting and fighting for social justice. His activist scholar background leads him to study other similar scholars and activists who want to promote social justice and want to make the world a better place. And lastly, his theory and understanding of interreligious dialogue is not simply one focused on religious leaders and scripture. He is skeptical, as he said, of religious leaders coming together and simply dictating and writing statements of what others should do. Rather, interreligious dialogue for him is the day-to-day. He mentions that the idea of going to a clock shop and getting his clock fixed and someone just saying he's a nice person, a good person, and that leading him to have a pleasant experience and dialogue. He also talks about the idea of food insecurity and climate change and how people on the ground are talking to each other and building partnerships. His idea of interreligious dialogue is people of different faiths working together and building various political and social coalitions. For Khairudin Aljunied, this is not something new or modern, but represents the history of Islam in Southeast Asia. In conclusion, I would encourage you to subscribe to a Common Word podcast, which is available on the major podcast streaming services such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can visit the Maidan website for more podcasts, blogs, and videos. You can order my new book, The Islamic Mary, Maryam Through the Centuries, which speaks about Christian-Muslim dialogue and dialogue in general. You can visit my website to learn more about my bio, research, and blogs. And you can join my listserv to be updated about my research, speaking, and publications, especially events and programs related to the Islamic Mary book. Thanks for listening to a Common Word podcast.